Hi, I'm Urmi, editor at Move Smartly. I'm pleased today to be returning to our occasional series, Move Smartly Ideas. Today, we're going to look at who's really to blame for Canada's housing crisis. So, John, I understand you're going to use your industry lens, your academic lens, to assess some of the claims around, exactly who's to blame for Canada's housing crisis. And today, you're going to take a closer look at the argument that cities are to blame.
Exactly. So, I think it's an important question. It's certainly something we've been seeing more of, and of course, hearing from. I mean, both our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre are effectively making this claim. I mean, if you listen to anything that they have to say about housing, they're both basically blaming the cities for this crisis. And I'm going to share just a couple of clips just so people can kind of see what I'm talking about, where Justin Trudeau blames cities for not allowing more housing, and effectively Pierre Poilievre making the same argument. I mean, he just calls them gatekeepers and political elites. But let's play these clips just to give everyone a flavor of what we're seeing and what our politicians are saying.
It's because we're facing a shortage of housing right now. And that's why prices of homes have become far too high. It's not fair to young people who feel like cities are turning their backs on them. When housing is that expensive, young people feel like cities don't want them. They feel like they can't succeed. But if young people can't succeed in our cities, then where can they succeed?
Government gatekeepers prevent us from building. Government gatekeepers add as much as $600,000 to a unit of housing in Vancouver, and about $350,000 to the cost in Toronto. Now, these gatekeepers are local, but the federal government sends them infrastructure money. And it's time to crack down on the gatekeepers. Enough sending big fat checks to municipal politicians who are causing homelessness and poverty by blocking home building.
Okay, so I mean, after taking a look at these clips, again, it's clear that the solutions our governments are proposing to solve our housing crisis really are about pushing cities to reform zoning, to sort of open up their policies to allow more construction, so builders can build, and that will make homes more affordable. I mean, certainly both leaders say that, and there are a number of academics and economists who make the same argument. Now, today I really wanted to take a minute to kind of unpack some of these theories. I guess I'm going to call them theories because we don't really know if they're facts. I mean, really challenging what our government's saying, because at least from my perspective, I mean, I work in the industry, and like everyone else, I'm impacted by what our government's doing. So, as someone who studies these issues, to me, it's important to sort of look at them and really question them to see if what they're proposing, passes the smell test. I mean, does it make sense? And is there, other markets, or is there a model that Canada is trying to follow when we think about this rapid sort of boom that we need to make our housing market more affordable? Now, when governments and politicians and economists sort of talk about these things on the supply side, what they're referring to, it's really rooted in sort of this academic research that argues that cities that allow for more homes to be built, that have, what we call in economics, an elastic supply of housing. So elastic meaning, if you have an elastic supply, the supply can increase and stretch quickly, a lot like an elastic. Cities that have an inelastic supply of housing, like San Francisco and like Toronto, cannot ramp up the supply of homes in response to a demand shock, for example. So the argument is that having an elastic supply is a good thing because, if we do have a demand shock, builders can just build more homes rapidly, which would kind of cool down the price growth. And, Urmi, I'm just going to ask you to read maybe a quote from economist Chris Mayer, who's at Columbia. And, he basically summarizes some of the academic research behind this. And I'll let you read that for our viewers and for our listeners.
Thanks, John. In markets in which there are a few zoning requirements, Glacier and Gurko show that house prices are determined by construction costs, even when growth in demand is high. In some fast-growing southern markets, such as Houston, Atlanta, or Charlotte, the easy availability of land explains how population can grow, yet house prices remain flat. When demand rises, builders acquire land and build new homes. Construction costs determine the price of housing in those markets. Yorko and Saiz.
Yeah, excellent. And I picked this quote because it's from a survey that Chris Mayer did, and surveys are really just kind of academics taking a bunch of research and trying to summarizing them pretty succinctly. And I thought this quote really summarizes the idea that underpins a lot of these academic papers that argue, making supply more elastic, reforming zoning is a good thing because it kind of cools down price growth. And that's exactly what this quote says. And the other reason I wanted to, I thought this is a great one, not just because it summarized it well, because all of these academics, from Mayer to Glazer, Yorko, Saiz, I mean, these are like the top academics in housing. I mean, they're in, Harvard, Wharton, MIT, Columbia. I mean, they're like the top academics. So, I mean, it's helpful to sort of have this as the foundation of what we're talking about and to think about if kind of what they're saying holds up. And I think maybe we'll start off by thinking about the markets, just quoted in this article: Houston, Atlanta, and Charlotte. Those are southern markets where they have technically relatively elastic supply of housing. And the first thing I want to look at is, okay, fine, they have an elastic supply of housing, but how is their population growing? Because there are other markets, in the Rust Belt in the US that also have an elastic supply of housing, but like their cities are declining and like people are moving out of them, so they're probably shrinking, right? So I mean, that is a market where, is not the best comparison. I mean, we want to look at markets that are also growing, and have a relatively elastic supply. And when we look at that, if we look at the growth in population, for example, over the past 10 years in Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Ontario, I mean, they're all growing. Texas is actually growing a bit more quickly than Ontario, which is very interesting. And Georgia and North Carolina, a little bit, not as rapid, but still growing, close to 10% on that period, which is strong. So, from there, I thought, why don't we look at the growth in prices in these cities and maybe include a few more cities in Texas, partly because I think Texas is a good case of a state that's actually growing more rapidly than Ontario.
And John, as you get into that, let me ask you one thing. So you're saying growing in terms of population numbers. Exactly. Ontario and Texas are seeing population growth. We've heard in America a little bit about the Great Southern Migration. So they're attracting, I think, in Texas, citizens from other states, exactly, due to cost of living crises. Yeah. And when you talk about elastic versus inelastic, I think we get that. But what is it about these markets that make it more elastic? So we understand. Is it the availability? I think in the quote we heard about land. Is that the major thing, that there is just more land available to build?
It can be a number of things. I mean, part of it is a land available to be built, right? So sometimes they'll look at spatially, like, what barriers are there on the availability of land? And some of them are geographic. Water, mountains, certain things like that would obviously restrict the availability of land. So availability of land that can be developed to housing is one thing. As the quote said, zoning requirements are another. The more barriers that cities put on the construction of new housing makes the market more elastic or inelastic, even if they have developable land. If you restrict and put, kind of walls up to be building homes, that would make a market more inelastic, I would say.
And in that construction cost idea that you've quoted there, is labor part of this calculation, where construction labor is relatively freely available, and I guess you can mobilize it quickly? That would presumably keep your costs down.
Yeah, I mean, I guess again, it's a part of the theory is that the prices would grow with construction costs. So even if you're constrained by labor and construction costs accelerate because of a labor shortage, the point is that is what would be driving home prices higher, right? So
it assumes all things equal.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So turning to Ontario and Texas, thank you.
Yeah. If we look at these cities and we consider a number of other cities in Texas, I think first off, I think it was helpful to kind of look back in time and say, okay, what was sort of the appreciation in prices, back when some of these papers, these seminal papers were written, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And when we look at the growth in house prices, in many of those elastic markets, and I'm comparing now against San Francisco, for example, in the decades between 1995 and 2005, all of these elastic markets saw prices grow by, roughly 50%, which is relatively modest. Whereas, San Francisco saw prices surge by over 200%, right? So if we look back in time, this idea that elastic supply is good kind of holds up. It looks pretty consistent. I mean, San Francisco's prices are exploding, potentially in theory, maybe because one of those reasons is supply constraints. Obviously, there are other factors. It's not only one, but at least when we look at the data, we see those markets with the elastic supply appreciating far more moderately, right? Which is kind of what this theory says. Now, the challenge is, if we fast forward and look at the price growth in all of these sort of elastically supplied markets, over the past 10 years, from 2012 to 2022, and, we throw in, San Francisco and Toronto in there just as an example. What we find is, and I kind of pulled all of these elastic supplied cities, and I kind of, visually for those on our channel, I've kind of ordered on the YouTube channel, I kind of ordered them from sort of high elasticity on the left to low elasticity on the right. And again, this is just based on the academic research. So, cities like Charlotte and Austin have the most elastic supply, and in theory should have the most moderate growth, whereas, San Francisco has the lowest elasticity, should be growing far more rapidly. And when we look at the growth in house prices in all of these markets over the past decade, it's just actually no big difference. I mean, and there is some volatility, some areas are doing a little bit more than others, but they've all basically appreciated from double, so 100% to 100 in Houston to 160% in Austin. San Francisco is just over 120, as was Toronto. So there's no story here that suggests that these markets with elastic housing supply see more moderate growth the way we saw, say, in the 90s and the early 2000s. I mean, right now, these markets are appreciating far more rapidly, and certainly their house price level is lower. Houses in San Antonio and in Houston and Austin are lower than they are in San Francisco. But again, obviously there are a lot of different factors behind that, these regional differences. But the point is, the theory says that if we make housing more elastic, we should not see these rapid accelerations, right?
And John, is your point really that comparing Charlotte, which has the highest supply elasticity, and then looking at Houston, which is really closer to San Francisco on the other side, with an inelastic supply, you're seeing the same levels of price growth? That's
exactly. And I should say, like, all of these cities except for San Francisco all have very elastic supply. I mean, even Houston and Dallas, which are sort of on the right sort of hand of our chart, still have a very elastic housing market if we compare it against other, cities in the US. So they're all actually very elastic. San Francisco and Toronto are kind of the only ones with a relatively inelastic supply. And you're right, there's not much difference between them.
And is the issue here then, sorry, John, maybe I've missed it, that you'd be even surprised to see the growth in price we're seeing from Charlotte to Houston? According to the theory,
yeah, I mean, they shouldn't
be growing.
They shouldn't be growing this rapidly, right?
Understood. Okay. And so it's not the magnitude compared to, as you said, San Francisco and other markets that, start from different levels in terms of price growth. We should expect these cities not to be showing this kind of growth at all. Doubling is a lot.
More than doubling, exactly. And like we said, like when we looked at the 90s and early 2000s, I mean, they grew by 50%, right? Now they're growing from 100 to 165 or something like that. So again, I'm not going to explain why. There are obviously reasons. I'm not an expert in Charlotte or Texas real estate. But the point is, that the idea that if we just, and the idea that our governments are promoting, that if you just allow builders to build, house prices will be affordable for all, does not appear to be holding up, at least in these US cities, right? Now, we can look at how these theories hold up also in Canada. Now, there's, a report from the Bank of Canada, an economist who looked at, similarly, the supply elasticity in a lot of big cities all across Canada, right? Cities like London, Ontario had the highest, Kitchener, Waterloo were among the highest, and of course, the lowest were cities like Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, right? So again, what I did is kind of looked at all of the cities pretty much in Southern Ontario. I mean, we're not going to look at, rural Ontario or outside of Ontario because we're kind of focusing on Ontario right now. Sort of how have home prices accelerated when we look at these markets that have relatively elastic supplied housing markets, and again, the top one in this report is London. And that London, I know for those of you who follow the politics recently, this is where that announcement, I think, or that video clip that Justin Trudeau was, I believe, was in London, Ontario, where they were celebrating, London's mayor encouraging more housing supply. So this is supposed to be the model we're supposed to be striving for, cities like this that allow builders to build, and, all the other cities that aren't doing that are hurting their local residents. But the challenge again is that if we look at the rate of appreciation in all of these cities that have a far more elastic supply of housing relative to Toronto, there's no difference. And in fact, quite frankly, they all actually appreciated more rapidly than Toronto over the past 10 years. Now, I mean, of course, Toronto is still more expensive than Kitchener, Waterloo, or London. I mean, but that should not be a surprise to anyone. The point is that, based on, I guess, the theories that our federal government and some economists are promoting, again, is that if you have a market like London, Ontario, that allows builders to build more rapidly, we're not going to see a rapid growth in prices. But that, of course, does not really hold up with the data. I mean, London home prices appreciated far more rapidly than in Toronto, right? So, I guess when we look at this, as someone who looks at housing markets as and is concerned about the growth, my question when I hear politicians and economists is, what's the solution that they're promising? Like, what is the model that they're promising? Because there are no cities, as far as I'm aware of, that kind of have the result that they're promising. You know what I mean? If you look at the cities with elastic supply of housing in Canada, they're all, or at least in Southern Ontario, they're also booming, right? So, the solution they're promising, which is to reform these policies and allow people to build, and quite frankly, their solution is to triple housing completions as a solution, does not appear to be something that is possible or has been done before. And there are, at least as far as I'm seeing, no cities that kind of fit this example, right? And I think that's a challenge right now as, for us, because when we think about the solutions, I mean, the one problem I see with this is that when you have policymakers, I mean, effectively tinkering with supply side policies. I mean, these are policies that do not result in an immediate change in new housing. I mean, recently the federal government removed GST on rentals, which is great. So that'll probably drive more rental supply. It'll probably lead to less condo supply, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to triple completions, right? So when you have most advocates arguing for what is effectively tinkering, I mean, hoping one more person builds a laneway home, or it's expecting everyone in the suburbs is going to convert their home to a fourplex. Are these the policies that are going to give us the result we want? I mean, our government says it is. Some economists say, yes, you can triple completions. But I don't know any country that has. I'll wrap up and then you can tell me if you have questions. But again, my perspective and something that we talked about on this channel is, everyone's blaming supply, right? The fact is the supply of housing is largely a constraint. It is fixed in the short term, right? Our governments know how many houses we're going to complete next year, roughly based on the number of homes that are under construction, right? When a government decides to ramp up our population, say by over 1 million people next year, right? When they know there are only 200,000 homes being built, I mean, it's really a decision that is going to see not enough housing for everybody, which effectively is going to push probably more people into homelessness, which we're seeing, and really driving up costs for the poorest households and forcing some to live in very deplorable conditions. So from my perspective, this crisis is a decision from the governments that are ensuring our population is growing faster than our ability to build housing. The fact that they're pretending that the supply of home can ramp up as quickly as they want to sort of grow our population, quite frankly, seems a little bit silly. And there's no example I've seen of countries that have done that and have still had affordable housing. And I think that's the challenge that I see when you look at the data and we look at other countries and you look at other cities. No one's doing what Canada's doing. We're growing among the fastest in terms of our population in the world. I think there's only like 5 other countries globally, and we're by far, I think, the fastest in like the G20. So, and I think this is, again, one of the challenges that is putting pressure on housing right now.
So let me revisit one of the things you're saying, just to make sure I understand the arguments that are being put forward. It's come up that the chances of Canada, and specifically Ontario, being able to ramp up, which historically it hasn't been able to, its housing completions to meet this sudden surge in demand is in question. Mm-hmm. But from the literature, I'm wondering if that's almost beside the point, because you're pointing out that in Charlotte and all these other Texas cities, when we look at the appreciation in house prices from 2012 to 2022, presumably they were able to expand their supply. They're able to do what we can't do. I'm not sure if you know about the magnitudes involved in what we're looking at.
Yeah.
But the argument there seems to be that even if you expanded the supply, something is causing those prices to continue to increase. Right?
So I did not look at, I mean, this is a high level analysis. I did not look at completions, housing completions in each city, how those changed over time, and how that lines up with population growth. So either one of two things happened. Either they were able to ramp up the way the theory tells us they should be able to, because there are few barriers to supply and prices went up anyways, right? Or they weren't able to ramp up supply as quickly as this theory says because there were other constraints beyond just zoning and land, labor or other things, right? So I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. It's not, I haven't researched it that closely, but one of those things is likely true.
Great. Actually, that's really helpful. And that leads me to 2 questions I have. So on the federal level, I think you've made the point very well. And now we hear people saying, these macro levers, the population growth that the federal government is really in charge of is so much more impactful and has been so much more consequential for the rise in house prices we've seen, particularly since 2015, the start of the Trudeau government, when we really saw population numbers rise. And then in the last few years, to an extent that we've never seen in Canada, now hitting the 40 million mark as a country. So I think that argument, though I know that you face many barriers, you were accused of xenophobia and other things to point this out, I'm noticing that this argument is starting to be, a little bit more understood. It's now become okay for major newspapers and outlets and political leaders to say, oh, maybe this population is out of control. Maybe we have to look at student visas and numbers of people coming in. So that, I think, is something that you've made really clear. I have a question for you, though, about before 2015. Is it possible that, in periods from 2009 onwards, we did occasionally see double-digit growth in the GTA area, which you consider to be unsustainable. That makes me wonder, are there other macro factors that, to be fair, should be equally looked at? Now, interest rates is one thing, because we've been in such a low interest rate environment following the crisis of the US subprime mortgage collapse in 2008, and then COVID and other periods have seen us with historically low interest rates. So that's one thing. But beyond that, Canada's federal government can also control how we regulate our mortgages, how we get mortgages, who gets mortgages. Other factors are investment. In Canada, the decision seems to be made that every other Canadian should become a landlord so that we can expand our housing supply. We'll just have citizens invest in condos. You know, so in Ontario, for example, it is very common to own more than one home and to own homes as investments. There's no extra taxation on third properties, fourth properties, like there are in other countries. Is it fair to say that none of these other factors have impacted things? Like, you know, did it already create some kind of structural imbalance, and then the immigration just put the fuel on it?
It's a great question. Okay, and there's a lot of, so for starters, looking back before 2015, home prices and rents, quite frankly, were appreciating far more moderately. And I've written a number of posts on this. I think, just off the top of my head, the longer term average of price growth before 2015, I don't know, for the 10 or 15 years that we have data for, was something like 6%, right? And yes, there were a few months where it was double digits. But if you look at the number of months where double digits collectively, it was something like 4% out of all the months in that period saw double digit growth, okay? If you fast forward to 2015, the average growth was something like 11% per year, and something like 60 or 65% of all the months in that period had double digit growth in house prices, right? So there's definitely, just if you look at the numbers without, you know, without, like, it's just statistical, like, you can't, price growth is price growth. There's definitely a tipping point in 2015, very similar with condominium, or with condo prices. And that's where we have condo rents, I should say, where the price growth, and I wrote about this maybe a month or two ago in my report, it was something like 1.5% in rent growth before 2015, and over something like 5% now. So there's definitely something that has happened since then. Now, is that to say that there have not been challenges before? 100% there were. There are so many challenges. I mean, Canada stopped building rental housing for decades, you know, and this was filled by, of course, investors buying condominiums. And this is, listen, I mean, even though I talk about investors having a dominant share in the market is problematic, but at the end of the day, this is how we built rental housing. And this is a decision from our government. They decided not to prioritize rental housing, which is changing now. Now they are. So we basically just financialized single family homes, converted them to, you know, mom and pop owned rentals. Is this a big factor? I mean, listen, to some extent, yeah. I mean, it's a bit complicated. Yes, that has contributed to the run up in prices, but at the end of the day, you know, the important thing to think about. So condos fill the void of sort of apartment rentals, right? But a massive number of investors have been buying single family homes and converting them to rooming houses, right, for international students, largely because universities have been ramping up their international student admissions without building housing for people, right? So there's pros and cons to it. Like, the one argument is, well, without these investors, these students would have nowhere to live, which is a fairly valid argument, right? The fact that some of them are not great conditions is not ideal, but the reality is these investors have provided housing for these students. The flip side to that argument is that is not the right way to build housing for international students. It's not good for the students. They're, you know, we have 8 people living in a freaking basement, and it distorts the housing market because more of our stock is going towards these rooming houses, investment properties that are illegal, quite frankly. So it's not great, right? So definitely some of these symptoms have been a product of our boom. Now, lastly, I'll say, you know, you talked about mortgage underwriting, stuff like that. The interesting thing is that before 2015, mortgage underwriting was actually far more loose, right? Back in 2006 and 7, you could get 40-year mortgages. You could buy properties with 0 down. You could buy properties with interest-only mortgages, okay? And even with such relaxed investor-friendly underwriting, we did not have an investor-driven housing boom. I mean, think about that. Like, those are ideal conditions for investors. 40-year amortization, 0% down, and interest-only mortgages. People would go crazy if you had that today. We didn't have that. And in fact, it tightened because not only did they get rid of all those policies, reduce amortizations on mortgages, they added a stress test, making people qualify at 2% more than they're actually paying on their mortgage. So mortgage underwriting has actually tightened, and that should take some technically steam out of the boom in prices. And prices still accelerated because of all of these other factors. So yeah, there's problems before, but things got definitely a lot worse after 2015.
All right. So going back to this theory of elasticity, you said there's two possible reasons. So one, maybe Charlotte and all these cities did build all of these homes, and that did not stop the prices from climbing. And that you are suggests that there's something about demand, that demand shock, that there's not, the elasticity argument just cannot, hold water when there are such strong demand changes and demand shocks. The other thing you suggested is maybe the case was that as demand grew in Charlotte, they were not able to keep up. And so supply could not increase to the same level. And of course, we know from our textbooks, increased demand, low supply, higher home prices. So let's turn to that second part. Is it fair in Canada, where cities are really the products of provinces? They are under the control of provinces. In many cases, they have a lot less levers than American cities have to do a lot of things. The provinces seem to come under less criticism, and I'm wondering why in this examination. In Ontario, for example, zoning is under the control of the government through their direct use of training construction, like if it's construction workers and labor shortages or something like that, that isn't allowing for the growth in supply to occur at the speed we want. And that's a real thing in Ontario. You're suggesting like some of the experts are suggesting that we're going to build 3 times the amount of housing, something we've never been able to achieve. If that's the case, isn't that the province's fault? Over the last 10 years, could they not have looked at zoning, looked at training more tradespeople? The provinces do have the ability to tell Ottawa, hey, we want these kind of immigrants, or fast track these kind of immigrants that are interested in construction jobs. Is it not fair to say that some of the supply side arguments that have been brought up are legitimate, and that really we should really look closely at the provinces and what they've done, which is a whole lot of nothing, it seems.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the key issue. I think to argue that the problem is the cities, is insane. Like, if you think about it, like if the solution is to get I don't know how many mayors there are in Canada, thousands, hundreds, you know what I mean? To get all of them on side to reform their policies is a little bit ludicrous. And I agree with you.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in Ontario, it's actually very possible in Canada. The Ontario government has the ability and
and that's what I mean. So
the growth plan. The mayors are not going to come up with it on their own. And in many cases, they can't. They really are being ruled by provincial policies.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So to expect the mayors to come to these conclusions on their own, independently of all the other mayors in the province, is insane. And I agree with you that many of the solutions that many housing advocates are advocating for, which I agree with, and I think that's one of the points of this. My point's not supply isn't good. We want more density, we want more housing. These are all good things. I really don't think it's like the bullet, the silver bullet that everyone's making it out to be. But I agree with you that many of those changes that we want and housing advocates want should be pushed by the province. We should not be waiting. And the province is slowly doing these things. But again, this is, I think one of the reasons why I've pushed back on sort of the supply advocates, because the speed at some of these changes happen, like these policies are not reformed overnight. You don't just wake up one day and say, okay, everywhere there's a single family home, I'm now going to allow a 10-unit apartment building to be built everywhere in the province. That doesn't happen overnight, right? Even legalizing fourplexes is going to take time. So, but yes, the province should be doing more. on the zoning front. And quite frankly, I mean, the province does play a very big role on the demand side. And I think it's that we often look at the feds for that. But when we think about international students, that's largely driven by the provinces. I mean, the provinces can just let in as many, I mean, the universities can let in as many students as they want. The provinces agree to it because the universities and colleges are getting far more money, and the feds just sign off on it. I mean, why the federal government didn't slow down and raise the alarm bells, I mean, is another argument. But it's the provinces that are driving much of the boom in international students, or at least behind it.
And if we could push back on finally one thought that you shared there, that these changes don't happen overnight. The Ontario government has had the Places to Grow Act in for years. This act was meant to have force, as much as provinces can force, encourage cities in the GTA-H, including Hamilton, to densify where they could. And to increase the number of housing provided. Now, what happened is years of pushback negotiations, mayors saying, oh, can we put this aside for this? Can we put this aside for that? And a lack of the province really pushing back and saying, no, you're not meeting your targets. Now, in the final years of that act, there started to become a little bit of pushback, only to see that entire act basically scrapped when we saw the change to the Ford government. So I'm not sure I'm totally convinced that some of these supply side arguments are just a case of things take time. And some research, for example, that I've seen out of Australia suggests maybe there, which faces many similar problems. It's starting to suggest that, you know, I know they're a bit on the fringes. We've talked a little bit to Cameron Marie about this, that actually there is something more insidious going on, that there are vested interests in keeping supply relatively restrained, that there's, and with the Greenbelt scandal that we've just seen from the Ford government, I'm starting to wonder, you know, if the provinces really had an interest in ramping up supply, couldn't they do a little better than they have done? Should we be so easy to accept that, hey, we can't ramp up completions? Is there not some vested interest from the current players in the industry, current lobbyists, current advocates, to maybe not have so many supply constraints go down? Because as we all know, more supply, usually prices go down. You know, I know it's starting to sound conspiracy theory, but I am starting to wonder if we are being plagued on the supply side by other things, cronyism, and other aspects. Is it true there's no vested interest to keep our supply side stuck?
100%. I mean, there's vested interest, which is probably what drove the Ford government to effectively open up the Greenbelt for, you know, Doug Ford's developer friends, which obviously now has been reversed. But many are saying obviously that wasn't necessary. There is land available to be built. But on top of that, of course, you know, there are, of course, many of the urban neighborhoods. When you talk about place to grow and developing in established neighborhoods, I mean, most of that has been done by building condos. And the one thing that the province didn't do even back then under McGuinty was to allow more density and more housing in existing single family home neighborhoods, right? And in Toronto, you know, I don't know what it is, like 60% of the areas, I think you can only build semis and detached homes. And most of them, I think, are just detached, quite frankly.
Only overturned recently.
Oh, okay, yes, I should backtrack. You're right.
Yes.
That's a very good point. But from this, yes, so only overturned recently where you can build fourplexes, but that was in place for a very long time.
Yes. And I do wonder, did that have to take as long as it takes? Or it took? I'm a little hesitant that these things take as long as they're taking. So I know there's a lot to dig into. I'm really intrigued by what we were seeing in Texas. I'd love to revisit that and to dig more into the academic research you're doing to see. I know it's very hard in housing, John, and maybe you can comment on this. How hard is it to come up with these big aggregate theories since housing is so local? You know, how hard is it to come up with these explanations?
It's very hard because, and I think I'd be interested in interviewing maybe on our episode one month, someone from Texas, an economist, to kind of unpack some of these dynamics, because you're right. I think it's important to understand, well, why it's not just, you know, I'm not just trying to make the point or supply elasticity is not good. Look at what happened down there. My point is that it didn't help them, right? So because prices boomed down there. So one question is, well, why did they boom? And understanding that, and was there other constraints? The other thing with the US and many of these southern states, and I think is important to understand, which we don't even have of as much up here, we have a lot of mom and pop investors. Down there, they have a ton of institutional investors. So they have a lot of Wall Street firms buying blocks of houses, buying them and converting them to rentals, which of course, again, is contributing to, some will say it's improving rental affordability, which, if you look at the data, they're not the best landlords. But they're, of course, probably contributing to the run up in prices because they're taking single family homes out of the available stock to be bought by families, and they're owned by corporations. So I suspect, and I'm not an expert in those markets, I suspect that's probably one of the factors that has contributed to the growth in areas like Charlotte. Because when you have billion-dollar companies buying homes in cash, outbidding mom and pops or end users, I should say, not mom and pop investors, but end users, that's going to kind of contribute to the boom in house prices as well.
And that brings us to the third thing, financialization of real estate. There was a great article in the New York Times about this, really looking at a neighborhood in which something like every other home was owned by one of these companies. I'll put that in the show notes. So yeah,
I found Charlotte. That was in Charlotte,
actually, and it was a detailed look at one street. And the story was really interesting. So what you're suggesting here then is, and I think it's a very important point you're making, the whole we just need more supply argument. And we have heard that in Canada everywhere, years and years and years. We just don't have the supply. We just don't have the supply. If we get the supply, things will be better. But we've now talked about a couple ideas that maybe throw that, that explanation into disarray. Are there just some demand shocks, whether it's immigration, students coming in, that just cannot be absorbed? Is another issue cronyism and something on the supply side where there's a lot of people doing things that we have not looked that closely at. And then the third thing you've brought up is a financialization, even if you build all the houses, if they're just going to get snapped up by investors with more money, that's not going to help prices at all. So a lot of potential ways to look, but what you're saying is basically, if I'm correct, is question that supply can come in and really save the day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of what led me to this, is really to question what our government's arguing, because at the end of the day, we are going to feel the impact of whatever solutions they put in place or proposing. And right now, Poilievre solutions are effectively the same as the Trudeau government's.
Right. And for viewers who are not certain, maybe even looking from outside, Poilievre is right now the leading, he's the leader of the Conservative Party, right now the leading party in the polls. If there is to be an election tomorrow, could be the new Prime Minister of Canada. So your point here is that some of the biggest solutions we're being given by both our current PM and maybe our soon-to-be PM are all around the supply side. And maybe we shouldn't take that.
And I think they're resonating for people because it sounds great. The gatekeepers are keeping, housing locked up. But again, I think they're resonating with people. I think because it's just like a lack of education of other housing markets, other dynamics. And when you look at the data, it's not as simple as the politicians make it sound, right? And
if I can stick up for the every person, it seems that on the academic side, it is hard to even come up with enough detailed studies to look at real estate, because it's hard to control these local variables. And that's what you're kind of pointing to. You can see these broad tendencies, but then, it's hard to say, oh, well, this is what happened in Charlotte. This is what happened in Houston. So not only is the public kind of, easily led to the supply side argument, there is a bit of a vacuum, it seems, and it would be interesting from the academics and the research side to hear a little bit more, to go beyond this level, and to hear a little bit more from the experts on some of the other ideas. So we hope to do that in future episodes of Move Smartly, both our regular programming and our occasional series ideas. Thank you so much for everyone joining us to listen and watch. John, if people have questions about the ideas you've shared today, where can they reach you?
Yeah, they can just send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.
Great. And I'm at editor@movesmartly.com. You're on the old X Twitter.
X. It's still Twitter to me.
Yes, at John Pasalis. You can reach me at Move Smartly on the same. Thanks again, and we look forward to presenting some new ideas to all of you soon.